Good evening. Welcome to Metropolitan Community College's virtual Diversity Matters film series. My name is Barbara Velasquez. Your microphones and chat with other audience members are turned off. Send questions to moderator Barbara Velasquez at any time for the discussion after the film. Watch for a link in the chat for an online evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback. Thank you for joining us this evening to watch a documentary that highlights American history that may not have been taught in your classroom. In 1988, César Chávez embarked on what would be his last act of protest in his remarkable life. Driven in part to pay penance for feeling he had not done enough, Chavez began his fast for life, a 36-day water-only hunger strike, to draw attention to the horrific effects of unfettered pesticide use on farm workers, their families, and their communities. Using never-before-seen footage of Chavez during his fast and testimony from those closest to him, directors Richard Ray Perez and Lorena Parley weave together the larger story of Chavez's life, vision, and legacy. A deeply religious man, Chavez's moral clarity in organizing and standing with farm workers at risk of his own life humbled his family, friends, and the world. Today is March 29th, and in a couple days here, March 31st, we will be celebrating César Chávez Day. It is a federal commemorative holiday celebrated to honor the enduring legacy of the American labor rights hero. Born to migrant laborers, Chávez's early life experiences shaped his ideology and made him the face of the 1960s labor movement. Through his persistent efforts and nonviolent protests, he became America's lightning rod. On March 31st, union members and community leaders come together to celebrate the life of this American icon and take inspiration from his 4 decades of selfless service to the workers of the United States. With no further ado, thank you for joining us to view Cesar's Last Fast. I want to thank everyone again for joining us tonight, and I will be introducing Richard Ray Perez, who is the Executive Director of the International Documentary Association and the Director of Cesar's Last Fast. Perez has been a featured speaker, panelist, and moderator at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, the Skoll World Forum, Sundance Film Festival, and the National Latino Studies Association. His presentations address the role of documentary film in creating social change and are informed by his 14-year career as a documentary film director and producer. His film work includes executive producing the multi-platform documentary series In Their Boots, a 29-episode project about the impact the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have had on communities across America, which was nominated for the 2009 International Documentary Association Award for Best Single Subject Documentary Series. He produced and directed the seminal political documentary Unprecedented, the 2000 presidential election, which the Los Angeles Times called a riveting story about the undermining of democracy in America. It has screened at 50 international film festivals, won 9 festival awards, and premiered on the Sundance Channel in 2004. He also co-executive produced The Freedom Files Season 2, a 9-episode series which aired on PBS about the impact civil liberties violations have on the daily lives of real people. Perez holds a BA in Visual and Environmental Studies from Harvard University. Please welcome Richard Ray Perez, or Rick Perez, and we're excited to have you with us here tonight.
Thank you, Barbara. I am so pleased to be here. I always enjoy speaking to students and speaking about my film.
Wonderful. So can you tell us, what was the journey like in directing Cesar's Last Fast?
Sure. It was actually a very, very long journey because it started in some ways long before I became a filmmaker. When I was a child in my hometown of San Fernando, California, which is about 20 miles north of downtown Los Angeles, I was in a Head Start program. It was primarily young Latino, mostly Mexican American and Chicano students attending that Head Start. I was about 4 years old, and university students from Cal State Northridge used to come and volunteer there. It was the early years of Head Start. When one day we were having our lunch, we were all, working class kids and basically poor kids. We used to get free lunch with our Head Start. We were having our lunch, and one of the university volunteers, a Chicano student from Cal State Northridge, was sitting down and having our lunch. And when it came to eating the grapes in this fruit cocktail, part of that lunch was bits of fruit and heavy syrup. I noticed that he started picking the grapes out of his fruit cocktail. This is like 1969, 1970. I was a very curious 4-year-old. And I said, "Ooh, how come you're picking the grapes out of your fruit cocktail?" And he held up a grape and he said, "Well, it's because the people who own the grape fields, they treat the people who pick the grapes terribly. They make them live in shacks. They pay them very little money. They humiliate them. And when the grape pickers complain, the grape growers, the people who own the fields, fire them." And he said, "For that reason, I can't eat these grapes." And I remember looking down at my grapes, and they became very ugly. I couldn't eat them either. So I started plucking the grapes out of my fruit cocktail. And all the other kids, my classmates, they were listening intently. And they started picking the grapes out of their fruit cocktail. And for the rest of the year, in Head Start and throughout elementary school, because these were all my classmates, we went to elementary school, we never ate the grapes because of that story. And I tell that story because it's a couple of things. It's an example of the power of storytelling. It's my connection to that farm worker struggle. And what I learned was later on as I grew up that my dad had been a migrant farm worker for about 22 years. And at that moment, when I was in that Head Start class, I had extended relatives and aunts and uncles who were still working in the fields. So I was deeply connected to that story. Eventually, the UFW came to my hometown to organize members of the community to boycott in front of the supermarkets to stop eating grapes. My dad packed up me and my sisters, and we went and held picket signs. That was long before I became a filmmaker. And so like I said, it's an example of the power of storytelling and my deep connection long before I became an artist.
Wow, that's really amazing.
And there's practical stuff about later on how, after I became a filmmaker, how that story came to me. But I tell that story because, yes, there's documentary film, right? And yes, there are social movements, but the convergence of storytelling and nonfiction storytelling and social movements and social changes has so much incredible power and potential. And the relationship that students have and young people and all people have to story and their human experience has meaning beyond just the immediate experience. And so the amplification of story can ripple throughout. There's no way I would have imagined how that experience in Head Start would have informed my life trajectory, but somehow it came back, and informed what is probably going to be the most powerful film and the most meaningful film to me ever.
Right. Yeah, I'm a believer that we all have those kind of moments. Yours is very beautifully articulated, and sometimes we don't recognize things that happened that affect us later in life, right? So it's exciting to hear your story. That's wonderful. So what then led you to become a filmmaker?
I was generally a pretty good student throughout school, elementary school, junior high, and high school. And interestingly, though, what we now know would identify is that I was a non-traditional learner. I was a visual learner and I was an experiential learner. I learned through experience. I take in visual information better than I do written information. Now, despite that, I had developed workarounds, and because I managed to be a good student, when I ended up at Harvard, which was a big achievement, because my dad, he himself only had an 8th grade education, and my mom came from Mexico. She hadn't finished high school or junior high for that matter. So when I enrolled at Harvard, I was really on my own. And I think in that environment, it really promoted self-discovery. And I found myself attracted to classes in what was the visual and environmental studies programs, basically visual studies and environmental design. And they had a series of filmmaking classes in that program that were documentary. So I interviewed and got a slot in the introduction to filmmaking course, which was specifically documentary. I didn't even know it was documentary. I just filmmaking, visual, I want to explore it. And so I got into the class, and that's where I was introduced to documentary filmmaking my sophomore year in college. And I took 3 years of documentary film in production. I had wonderful teachers who were very nurturing, very enlightened, because I came from a social background. Unlike most of my classmates at Harvard, they recognized that. And so they were able to encourage me despite an environment that was otherwise very intimidating to me. So they introduced me to documentary making, 2 filmmakers specifically, a guy named Rob Moss and Ross McElwee, who still teach at Harvard to this day and who become accomplished filmmakers themselves. And at the end of my intermediate class, the second year of documentary filmmaking, Ross McElwee, he told me, Richard, I think you have a documentary eye. I would like to encourage you to go into documentary. Now, hearing that, that was like hearing advice to become a professional poet, because at the time, there was really no way to make a living as a documentary filmmaker. This was the 1986. So when I got out of college, I came back to LA. I tried to work in the scripted nonfiction or fiction world, independent, and that went nowhere. So I did that about, almost 7 years, and had different sort of plan B jobs. Around 2000, there's what we now call the digital revolution. Video cameras became affordable, where you can buy a video camera that could produce a broadcast quality image, and then you can start editing on a home computer. And that was a big change, because before that, cameras were hugely expensive and editing systems were very expensive. So a friend and I, we went in halves on a camera and went in halves on a home desktop editing system. And I made my first film, which was about the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles in 2000. Out of that film, that led to my real first film, Unprecedented. So it was kind of like, introduction to documentary filmmaking in college in a very sort of nurtured and frankly a privileged environment. But then just the timing of the digital revolution and the accessibility of the equipment that I just started doing it kind of like, do it yourself by any means necessary.
So you've shared that experiential learning and learning other than on paper is more attractive to you or more effective. Mm-hmm. But one of our viewers wanted to know if you could recommend a book on Cesar Chávez that you thought was a good one.
I would say there's no one book. Cesar Chávez was a very complex man. And there are very different opinions now in retrospect about his role in society and his effectiveness as a leader. As I alluded to in the film, there was a moment when the Union was very successful and that it caused a lot of problems in success. One of the things that the big takeaways in my making the film, there are many things about a film that can make it good. One of it is if it imparts wisdom, both to the viewer, and if it imparts wisdom to the filmmaker making it. So all that is to say is there's not one book per se. There's a book called Delano, very early. It was done by a New Yorker writer. I would suggest that is a starting place because that really captures the revolutionary spirit of the early days of the UFW. Now, since then, there's been a lot of criticism that I think is not necessarily fair about Cesar. They're worth looking at, but I forgot, Ms. Powell did one. It's very hard. It's very easy to criticize in retrospect the shortcomings of the social movement. But I would start with Delano. That was written like as the union was forming by a New Yorker writer, started as a series of articles in the New Yorker, and then became a book.
And that's Delano.
And correct.
Just like the town.
Yeah, I'm gonna look at the shelf real quick. I'm sure I have it.
Okay.
Might take me a bit, but yeah, you can Google it. It's easy to find.
Okay. Thank you. So as you worked on this film, what did you learn about Cesar Chávez? And other, you've told us that there's conflicting theories out there.
Yeah, so one of the things I've learned is that the net result of Cesar's work is profoundly positive. One of the things that I learned was that Cesar set out to do something very specific, and that was organize farm workers, create a system that would, an economic system around the union that would make life better for farm workers. He succeeded at that for a while. Ultimately, it was very difficult to sustain that. So most farm workers in this country, work under pretty bad conditions, nowhere near as bad as when Cesar started, but he and the movement didn't permanently fix that problem. But what he did that in some ways was more profound and not entirely intended, he inspired generations of mostly young Latinos, that he empowered them. He gave them a sense of dignity, independent of whether they came from farm worker families or not. Before Cesar organized successfully, Latinos in this country, and not unlike Latino immigrants today, didn't feel fully integrated and embraced by the American system and the American dream. Cesar made them feel like they had power and dignity, and that they could fulfill big things in their life. Like I said, independent of whether they're a farm worker family or not. That's bigger than the success of his specific mission. I know for myself, my dad, he was a migrant farm worker, and he was a migrant farm worker during the Depression. And he internalized a lot of the shame that came with that era. And as I was growing up, I saw the effect of Cesar's movement. It made him proud. And he had so much more dignity, even though by the time I was growing up, he was no longer a farm worker. My dad felt a lot of power, and Cesar did that also for university students during that era. And to this day, people who see the film and know about Cesar, there's a reason there's a holiday after that. It's that ripple effect that he gave a people who were previously undervalued by our society. He gave them dignity. He showed them that they have worth and power in a way that they may not have known before.
So I think you really demonstrated that well in the film. I'm thinking about some of the scenes where you would go across a crowd and see the little young kids shouting out, and then the elders, and you can see the pride. You can really see it in
Yeah.
their faces. So yeah, that's really.
Yeah, and the clergy, there's some scenes where you see the clergy coming together. It was such a powerful and inspirational movement. I often say that it's kind of the untold civil rights chapter in our nation's history. It's certainly undertold.
We started out by talking about how this is a part of American history that probably wasn't taught in your classroom, right?
Yeah.
And so there's so many untold stories out there.
Yeah. The other thing that I learned too, and this shouldn't be as a surprise, because it's the power of faith. So certainly in the traditional American civil rights movement, African Americans fighting for the vote and to undermine Jim Crow and dismantle Jim Crow in the South, that was a faith-based movement primarily, as we saw by Martin Luther King Jr.'s spirituality. Similarly, in this case, the specific Catholic faith was immensely powerful. I mean, first of all, that's what inspired Cesar to fast. He undertook 3 major fasts. That's what inspired the clergy to get behind him, right? And so, now when we think about social movements today, we see them primarily as secular movements, right? And I have to admit, I was raised Catholic. I'm no longer Catholic. I identify as Buddhist, but I have immense respect for the power of faith. And in this story, Christianity and Catholicism, how it moved people's soul, how it moved Caesar's soul, how it really just infumed spirituality and social justice. That is quite unique in this movement. And I can't say we've seen anything quite like it since.
Those are some notes that I was taking from the beginning about there were so many different reflections of the importance of spirituality to him, including the comments about he is descending from potentially Mayans, right?
Yeah.
And that spiritual reality that is possibly much stronger or more lived out on a daily basis. And then when he made the altar to get the workers to come out of the fields where they could worship. That was
Oh yes, I mean the building of the shrine outside the field, and there's when you make a documentary, often you stumble upon stories and information, and one of the beauties of this film was interviewing Luis Valdez. So Luis is a playwright, a filmmaker, a real sort of groundbreaking artist. So Luis had made the connection around Caesar's spirituality, potentially connecting before the Christianizing of the Americas. That Caesar had indigenous blood, and that on some deep level, his connection to his spiritual identity preceded the arrival of the Europeans. And it was, Luis Valdez was so poetic about it when he drew the conclusion of what we call penance was a type of sacrifice that the Mayans had practiced. So there's just layers and layers of meaning around the spirituality alone that we see the iceberg above the surface of the water, which is the Christianity, but there's something deeper and deeper that precedes, the Christians coming to the Americas.
Okay, we have a comment and question that's come in. What a powerful, oops, just a second, that's something moved here. Okay, what a powerful, moving film. I was impressed with Cesar's use of nonviolent resistance. Did he continue to espouse this approach in his later years?
He was always committed to nonviolence, and he was always committed to spirituality. So as you recall in the film, he began his fast when he was already 61 years old. So he lived his values. Now, that's a very hard thing to do, right? I mean, even this in our everyday lives, when we make decisions, if we can afford to buy organic, if we can shop at or purchase food at a fast food restaurant, they may underpay their workers, etc. Those are very hard things to do every day. But really, Cesar did try to live by his values in all manner. And that's a hard thing to do. So I would say, yes, to his last day, he espoused violence. To his last day, he was really committed to the spirituality that inspired his leadership.
Another question, are the Chavez children carrying on elements of their father's life and work now?
The answer is yes, and in different ways. So the main institution that carries on his legacy is the Cesar Chávez Foundation. They've expanded well beyond just supporting farm workers. So they build housing for low-income people. They do a lot of direct community services in ways outside of the farm worker fields. Because Cesar always thought that it's not just about the working conditions in the field itself, it's about the quality of life holistically. So the Cesar Chávez Foundation focuses on this sort of holistic approach. Now, the UFW still does exist, and they have a new leader, Teresa Romero. They don't have the same number of members that they did at the height of the union in 1975. There's a general pattern in this country around unionization. You know, unions have fallen out of favor. It's changing a bit nowadays, but the union doesn't have the membership and the influence that it once did.
All right. Okay, I'm trying to make sure I go the right direction with these questions. Well, I would like to say we have commented on the holiday is in 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hopeful that the documentary, having seen it tonight, helps you to live out that holiday just a little bit more on Thursday and share it with others. For those of you who are Metropolitan Community College personnel or students, because we have community folks here too, but for those who are, you can access this film through the library's streaming services. They always support us. Thank you to the Metro Libraries by purchasing the perpetual screening license. Right? So you can come back and enjoy that. Faculty, you can show it to your students, or you can have your students do special projects on it. The other thing that we are looking at is it is Women's History Month. And I want to applaud you for involving Dolores Huerta as much in this documentary as you do, because I have heard that perhaps she was not as recognized as she deserved in this fight.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. I mean, first of all, we all know that just societies in general tend to give men more credit than the women who are either sometimes working harder, working behind the scenes. You know, it was kind of coincidental that this film focused on Cesar, and I'll get to that in a bit. Dolores deserves a lot of credit. She fought alongside a movement that was dominated by men. And if you imagine men, mostly Latino men, in that era, that means she had to really stake out her claim. And the media and people in general want to identify one hero. And so it's very easy for them to single out Cesar because he was so charismatic and so public. But social movements are made of many, many people. right? It's our wanting to have a shorthand to point to one man. So in the case of the civil rights movement in the South, we want to say that it's Martin Luther King, but it was thousands of people and many leaders. So, we often want to do a shorthand and imagine one hero. There are multiple heroes, and certainly the Lotus is one of them. There's a very good film about the Lotus that I hope your students in the community get to see, called The Lotus, that focuses on her. I say it's accidental that I made this film because just through sort of coincidences and circumstances, I inherited access to the footage about César Chávez fasting. And when I saw that footage, I got all these tapes that said, day 1, day 15, day whatever. And I'm like, what's on these tapes? I knew I had this, box full of César Chávez tapes, and it was the fast. And I saw that sequentially that there's he's getting weaker and weaker, and that there was an arc there. And that's sort of the reason why I made this film. It comes from a kind of a much more artistic expression, and that is the following. And I learned this in a very early art class at Harvard. You'll often, in this art class, they would just give you a medium, clay, sand, and you just get that stuff and you see, what can you make with it? With clay, you can make a pot, you can make whatever, but it's like working with the properties of just that thing, right? As opposed to oh, well, then I'm going to add paint to it, I'm going to bring some wire. No, you just work with the clay, right? And see what the clay alone can do, how you can shape it, what are its limits, what's there. They're following it was sand. What can you do with the sand, etc. So I approached this footage of the fast kind of like that clay. What's there? I'm just going to work with this. And there was something so beautiful that was that trajectory of the fast that we saw, with the suspense and the commitment, and that I didn't want to bring all these other things to dilute it, right? And because once you start overpiling stuff, I sort of describe it as a Christmas tree with too many ornaments that don't match, and the leaves are sagging and the branches are sagging. And no, there was something beautifully in the simplicity. I just have to work with that. I don't thank you for laughing, Cynthia, but when I work with filmmakers and we got to tell this, and what about this, and what about this, and what about this? I'm like, no, too many decorations. I'm confused, right? That there was a simple grace in that fast footage, and I just added enough to help the viewer understand it.
This is so amazing, because without my asking the question, you're answering some of the questions. And one of them was, as a documentary, with that being your specialty, how do you know what to include and what not to include?
Yeah.
Right? Because the story is always so multifaceted, right?
Yeah.
You basically said that.
Yeah, and there's different approaches. That was the approach that I took. And sometimes I'll say there's that, like the clay. Do you discover what's there? Some filmmakers have a different approach, and it's not wrong, it's different. Some, I say, will have the Jello mold approach. They know the Jello mold, right? They're just going to fill it either with sand or plaster or whatever. They know the shape, and they have it, and it's done. Whereas me, I have to play and construct organically, right? So there are different approaches, and as you're in my process, as you're playing with the clay, right, and you can discover, oh, it stretches this, but if I make it too spiky, it's going to break off, or so there's, in the making of itself, there's a discovery. So as we edited, right, and we edited over months and months, the question of what do you include and what do you not include becomes clearer, right? So there was stuff we wanted to include, but it didn't fit, right? There was stuff I didn't think I was going to include, but all of a sudden the space opens up. You're like, that's the perfect place for it. So there's a great editor that I heard speak when I used to work at Sundance Institute, who said, as you're editing the film, the film starts to develop its own antibodies and it pushes out things that don't belong, right? And also there are openings where things start to appear that they belong. So for example, that story about Richard Chavez, Cesar Chávez building the shrine for the Virgen de Guadalupe and driving it outside into the farms, like Luis Valdez told us that story. And I thought, that's an amazing story. I have no idea where to put it, right? But as we are editing it, there became a space. I'm like, maybe it goes there. But then the next problem is we have no visual material to enforce that. And by then we are working with an archival producer and researcher. And she found this old footage of the women singing hymns in front of that shrine. And then we found another former organizer who had discovered an old member of the union who had photographed all these photos and never shared them. And he was, sick and poor and living in a trailer park, but he had all these negatives. And they included photographs of that shrine on the back of the station wagon. So all of a sudden we had this material, the visual material from the women singing and the still photograph to bring the story that Luis Valdez told us about the shrine outside of the farm field coming to life. When I started the film, I had no idea about that story. And then Luis tells me, and I'm like, this is beautiful. There's nothing to support it. Because I'm always the one like, it's not enough to tell them, you have to show them. I'm not a big fan of take my word for it filmmaking, right? And so I had the story, I had this material, and it becomes an experience now when you put all that together.
Awesome. That's really awesome. I think that is also a story of believing that things will come together. You just got to keep your ears and your eyes open, right?
Yeah, there was a phrase I heard. I spent 7 years making this film. The first year was just getting all the legal rights and paperwork in order. Second 6 years was fundraising, and you go to these workshops and seminars and that these different funders have. But one of the funders, he said an expression about the creative process that really stuck with me. And the phrase was, cultivate the emergent. And what happened was this story kind of emerged from the interviews, the footage emerged, and I just worked with it. And that what came was that scene.
Nebraska has its farm workers. It's not the situation that you have in California, but there's also definitely a divide between people who understand what the farm worker life is and those who do not. And I want you to know that one of our instructors of human services has shared that this will be the best video to help my students learn and understand. Thank you, Mr. Perez, for making a difference on a video that also makes a difference.
Thank you.
The final question I have is, again, Thursday is Cesar Chávez Day. What do you think contemporary audiences and communities can still learn from his life?
Wow. I think, I often, when I work with young filmmakers and I mentor filmmakers, I often ask them, like, if you can distill the story you're telling into one word, what would that word be? And I think that applies here. What can we learn from Cesar Chávez? It's devotion. He was so devoted to his cause and lifting up the quality of life of farm workers because nobody else was doing it at the time. So I think it's the power of devotion, commitment, and in his case to the quality of life of farm workers. And so when we think about what's our takeaway? What can we learn about Cesar Chavez for those of us who are inclined? And Cesar is a very special person. Not everybody can be like Cesar Chavez. I tell people I can't go 3 hours without a meal, much less 36 days, right? So I'm not suggesting anybody try to model their life after Cesar, but there are ways that we can embody devotion to causes in however way we are capable of. I think that's what we can learn from Cesar Chavez.
Thank you. So we are going to wind down here, but if you have any other thoughts that you would like to share with the audience, do you have any last comments for us tonight?
So it's particularly inspiring that you all in Nebraska are watching this film. You know, people in California are a little bit more familiar, but generationally, his story gets lost. I would encourage and inspire you that to share Cesar's story, and because it's accessible through the college, share the film with your friends and neighbors and screen it and really help more people understand who this man was, his movement and commitment, particularly in parts of the country where they're not likely to know his story. As I'm sure many of you who saw the film experienced it in a way other than if I just had told you about it. Yeah, I can tell you he's a great guy. And yes, there's a holiday in some states and streets are named after him in different cities. Very different when you experience the power of audiovisual storytelling that I try to capture in my film. So I hope that you can be inspired to share the film and sit down with people who may know nothing about him or may know little about him. Even people that thought they knew the story. When it was screening at film festivals, I had activists from different movements saying, I thought I knew the story. And one person came to me, he's like, but the beauty is in the details. And I didn't know those details. So I encourage you, share the film, see it with your kids, your neighbors, your members of your church, is anybody who you want to share that experience with.
Thank you. That's very generous of you. And it's just it's a really good message that we need to share. We do. We need to get out there and encourage people to watch. So I would ask, I want to, first of all, thank Mr. Perez for being with us tonight. It's always amazing.
Thank you guys.
Wonderful to have someone closely related to a documentary. What a nice way to end our evening tonight.
Yeah.
You're helping us gain even more as we explore true American history. And audience members, you're commended because you prioritize your time. Starting to seem like spring a little bit. It's kind of chilly and not chilly around here, but evening audiences are not always easy to find, and I appreciate you. I want to thank Joe, who's been our technician and made sure that everything ran so carefully. Would you please put up the evaluation slide, Joe? There we go. So we have an online evaluation in the chat. You can click on that address, and we really do appreciate your feedback. And then I would like to share our next program, which is our final program in Women's History Month. And it is a documentary called A Fine Line. And this documentary will explore why less than 7% of head chefs and restaurant owners are women, when traditionally women have always held the central role in the kitchen. We'll get started at 4:30 p.m. CDT, and our discussion will be led by Kathy Curtis, known to many of you, one of our MCC culinary arts instructors. So I look forward to seeing you on Thursday afternoon, 4:30 start time. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perez.
Okay, bye-bye.